They thought they mastered war, then they challenged humanity. The Vareth Dominion had not lost a war in 312 years. They kept count. It was the kind of thing you kept count of when the number was large enough to mean something, when it had been long enough that losing had become theoretical rather than lived, when the last generation that remembered what defeat felt like had been dead for 2 centuries, and the institutional memory of failure had been so thoroughly replaced by the institutional memory of victory that the Vareth military didn't study defeats anymore. They studied their own victories. They studied the moments when the enemy broke, when the line collapsed, when the commander on the other side understood that the thing they had been afraid of was real and was happening, and there was nothing left to do about it. 312 years. 47 wars. Not one loss. The Vareth called themselves the architects of conflict, which was the kind of name a civilization gave itself when it had been winning long enough to believe that winning was a property of the self rather than a property of the situation. It was a name that said, "We don't just fight wars, we understand war at a level others don't. We have mastered the thing that every other species only practices." Senior war architect Draven Solt believed this completely. He was 58 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years inside the Vareth military apparatus, and he had the specific quality of a person who had been right about important things enough times that being right had stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like a confirmation. He was not arrogant in the way that stupid people were arrogant. He was arrogant in the more dangerous way. The way that came from genuine competence compounded over decades into something that looked like wisdom from the inside, and looked like a specific kind of blindness from the outside. He had studied humanity for 8 months. 8 months of intelligence reports, battle records, diplomatic communications, accord filing histories, military capability assessments. 8 months of reading everything the Vareth intelligence apparatus had assembled on the species that sat in the Accord, and had been sitting there for 15 years and had, in those 15 years, accumulated a reputation that was somewhat inconsistent. The inconsistency was what had caught his attention. Humanity's reputation in the Accord was, depending on who you asked, one of 2 completely different things. Ask the species that had worked with them closely, the Vethani, the Keth sovereignty, several of the smaller Accord members, and you got a picture of a civilization that was capable and reliable and surprisingly easy to work with once you understood how they communicated, which was directly and sometimes uncomfortably directly, but without the elaborate face-saving structures that made diplomacy with some Accord species exhausting. Ask the species that had tested them, the Drevari, the old Sorathi hegemony before the relationship changed, the various smaller actors who had tried things in corridors where humanity had interests, and you got a different picture entirely. A picture that involved phrases like responded immediately and did not negotiate from a position of weakness and the specific sentence. From a Drevari intelligence report that Solt had read 3 times, we did not expect them to close to engagement range at that speed. The inconsistency was, how could the same species be, simultaneously, genuinely interested in peaceful resolution, and apparently completely comfortable escalating to combat when they decided peaceful resolution wasn't on the table? Solt had spent 8 months trying to resolve this inconsistency. His conclusion at the end of 8 months was that it wasn't an inconsistency at all. It was a strategy. A very old, very deliberate strategy, present as non-threatening in every context where non-threatening produced good outcomes, escalate immediately and completely in every context where non-threatening didn't. The switch between the 2 modes was not slow and not gradual and not preceded by the kind of warning signals that most species provided before moving from diplomatic to military posture. It just happened. Immediately. Completely. Solt thought he understood why. A species that spent 4,000 years at war with itself had learned something that species who had only fought external opponents hadn't learned. It had learned that the moment between deciding to fight and fighting was a moment the other side could use. It had learned that warning your opponent that you were about to escalate was a gift to them. It had learned that the psychological impact of an opponent who moved from non-threatening to fully engaged without a transition period was a force multiplier that no amount of additional hardware could replicate. It was, Solt admitted, a sophisticated approach. He thought he understood it. He thought understanding it was enough. He was wrong about the second part in the specific way that people were wrong when they understood a thing intellectually, and believed that intellectual understanding was the same as practical preparation. It was not the same. It had never been the same. The Varath Dominion had 47 wars of evidence that understanding an opponent's doctrine was useful, and that experiencing an opponent's doctrine was different, and that difference was where 47 wars had been won. But the 47 wars had all been against opponents who had not also spent 4,000 years learning the same lesson from the other direction. Solt presented his recommendation to the Dominion's War Council in the spring. The recommendation had 3 parts. The first part was a threat assessment, which concluded that the Terran Confederacy's military capability was significant but not superior to the Varath Dominions in any category that was decisive. The distributed grid technology was noted. The lunar installation capability was noted. The psychological escalation approach was noted and assessed as manageable given adequate preparation. The overall assessment placed the Terran Confederacy as a peer competitor rather than a superior one. The second part was a strategic objective, which was the Vela Corridor, a transit region between the Accord's outer boundary and the Varath Dominion's expansion frontier that had been the subject of competing claims for 3 years, and that the Accord's arbitration process had been failing to resolve to the Dominion's satisfaction. Solt's assessment was that the arbitration process would not produce the outcome the Dominion required, and that a military resolution was preferable to another 3 years of procedural delay. The third part was a plan, which was a 3-phase campaign designed to establish Varath military presence in the Vela Corridor before the Terran Confederacy could mount an effective response, hold that presence through the initial Terran response, and negotiate from a position of de facto territorial control once the Terran Confederacy recognized that the cost of removing the Varath from the corridor exceeded the strategic value of the corridor itself. The War Council approved all 3 parts. Solt was given command of the operation. He spent 6 weeks preparing. He did not contact the Terran Confederacy. He did not issue ultimatums. He did not provide warning. He had studied the human approach to conflict long enough to understand that warning was a gift, and the Varath Dominion did not give gifts to opponents. The operation began on a Thursday. Colonel James Ockhaffer was in the middle of a briefing on sensor array maintenance schedules when the alert came through, and he had the specific experience, that Thursday morning, of watching a room full of people receive information that changed the shape of the next several months of their lives simultaneously and in real time. The alert was from the Accord's deep range sensor network, automated, triggered by a mass transit event at the outer edge of the Vela Corridor. Multiple contacts, inbound, moving fast. Ockhaffer looked at the contact count on his pad. 83. He said, "Clear the room, keep senior staff." To his communications officer, "Get me fleet command, priority 1." The room cleared. The senior staff stayed. The communications officer got fleet command on the line in 40 seconds, which was fast, and fleet command was already reading the same sensor data, which meant the next 4 minutes of conversation were not about what was happening, but about what they were doing about what was happening. General Patricia Ockhaffer, his sister, which was a thing that created specific complications in a military hierarchy, and that both of them had navigated for 10 years with the particular professionalism of people who had decided that the job was the job and family was family, and the 2 categories did not get to be confused. was on the line from the command bunker. She said, James. He said, Patricia. She said, 83 Varath contacts entering the Vila corridor. No declaration, no warning, no prior communication. He said, I see it. She said, you're the senior Terran military officer in the region. He said, I'm aware. She said, what do you have? He told her. What he had was one heavy cruiser, the TCS Franklin, his flagship, 2 destroyer-class vessels, a patrol frigate, and a resupply tender that was armed but not a combat vessel. 5 ships against 83 contacts, in a corridor that the Varath had apparently decided to enter without discussion on a Thursday morning. Patricia said, reinforcements are moving. I have 6 Sovereign-class vessels 4 hours out. Accord allies have been notified. Vethani element is 6 hours, Sorathi is 8. 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours. He had 5 ships. He said, rules of engagement. She was quiet for 1 second. The 1 second of someone making a decision that had already been made but needed to be said aloud. She said, defend the corridor, don't initiate. If they advance on your position, treat it as hostile. If they fire, respond fully. A pause. James. Patricia. 4 hours. I know, he said. The channel closed. He looked at his senior staff. 7 people around the briefing table in a room that smelled like recycled air, and the remains of the coffee that nobody had touched since the alert came through. Lieutenant Commander Yuki Webb at Intelligence, who was already running analysis on the Varath contact formation. Major Carlos Torres at Operations, who had the operational picture on his pad and was building the response plan in the specific fast way that Torres built things, which was by starting from the outcome and working backward. Captain Aiko Park at Communications, who was managing 4 simultaneous channels with the calm efficiency of someone who had more experience than her rank suggested. Chief Master Sergeant Ray Hayes, who was the senior NCO and who sat with his arms folded, and his face doing nothing, and who was watching Akafor with the attention of someone who would follow wherever this went, and wanted to understand clearly where that was. And Major Diana Reyes at Tactical, who was 29 years old and had a gift for spatial combat mathematics that had made her the youngest major in the regional command, and who was currently starring at the Varath formation analysis on her pad, with the expression of someone reading something very carefully before saying anything. Akafor said, Raise. She looked up, Sir. Formation analysis, what am I looking at? She looked back at her pad, not because she needed to look at it, she had already read it, but because she was deciding how to say what she was seeing. The Varath formation is standard offensive deployment, she said. Forward assault elements fast, well-armed, the kind of ships that go in first and take fire while the heavier elements position. Fire support platforms behind them. Command element at the rear. She paused. It's a good formation, sir. They know what they're doing. But, Akafor said, because there was a but in her voice. But it's designed for a fight against an opponent who is going to try to hold a line. She looked at him. It's designed to break a line. Fast attack forward, break the line, fire support comes through the gap, command element advances. Clean. Against an opponent who is going to form a defensive perimeter and hold it, this formation is exactly right. Another pause. Against an opponent who doesn't hold a line. It's less clean, Akafor said. Yes, sir. Torres said from across the table. We don't have enough ships to hold a line. I know, Akafor said. So we're not holding a line. No, Akafor said, we're not. He looked at the formation on his pad, at 83 contacts and 5 ships in 4 hours. What are we doing, Rays? She had been waiting for this question. He could tell from the specific quality of her stillness that she had been working on the answer since she read the formation analysis and had been waiting for him to ask it. We're making them react to us, she said, instead of reacting to them. She pulled up the corridor map on the briefing room display. The Vela corridor has 3 choke points, narrow transit lanes where the debris field on either side reduces the viable approach vectors. The Varath formation is built for open space engagement. At a choke point, the front width of their formation is limited by the transit lane geometry, which means they can't bring their full forward element to bear simultaneously. She pointed at the first choke point. We position here, not to hold to force them to compress. When they compress, their fire support platforms lose their line of sight on the forward element because the fast attack ships are between them and us. The formation that was perfectly optimized for breaking a line is now optimized for getting in its own way. The room was quiet. Webb said they'll adapt. Yes, Reyes said, they will, but adapting takes time and adapting under fire takes more time, and every minute they spend adapting is a minute we're not losing ships. She looked at Akafor. 4 hours, sir. We need 4 hours. Akafor looked at the display, at the choke points and the formation and the 4 hours. He thought about his sister, saying his name on the command channel. He thought about 5 ships. He said, how do we not lose all 5 ships buying that 4 hours? Reyes almost smiled. Not quite. We don't stay still, sir. We hit them at the first choke point, we move before they fully adapt. We hit them at the second choke point, we move again. We make them chase us through a corridor where chasing us costs them more than catching us would give them. Torres said, we're going to take fire. Yes, Reyes said, we're going to take fire. The question is whether we take fire while we're moving and making them react, or whether we take fire while we're holding still, and they're doing exactly what their formation is designed to do. She looked at Torres. Moving is better. Torres looked at Akafor. Sir, with respect, this is a plan for 5 ships against 83 that requires perfect execution under combat conditions. I know, Akafor said. The margin for error is. I know, Torres. He looked at the display one more time, at the corridor and the choke points and the 4 hours. What's the alternative? Torres didn't answer, because there wasn't an alternative, because everyone in the room had already done the calculation, and the calculation said the same thing every time. We move, Akafor said. We hit them at the first choke point. We make them compress. We don't stay still. When the reinforcements arrive, we hand them a Varath formation that has been reacting to us for 4 hours and has not accomplished its objective. He looked at Reyes. Your tactical lead on this. Reyes said, yes, sir. What do you need? Full authority on positioning calls during the engagement. Real time, no committee. You have it, Akafor said. What else? I need the Franklin senior helm officer briefed on what we're doing. The maneuvers I'm going to call require the helm to respond in under 5 seconds, or the position advantage disappears. Park, Akafor said. Park said, I'll get Lieutenant Vasquez on the channel. He'll be briefed before we reach the first choke point. Good, Akafor said. Torres, coordinate with the destroyers and the frigate. They need to understand the plan and they need to follow Reyes' positioning calls. This only works if all 5 ships move together. Torres said, understood, sir. Akafor stood up. He looked at his senior staff for a moment. 7 people who had been in the middle of a briefing on sensor array maintenance schedules 40 minutes ago, and were now planning a 4-hour combat action against 83 contacts. He said, the reinforcements are coming. Our job is to make sure there's a corridor left for them to come to. He paused. Let's go. They went. Solt, on the command element at the rear of the Varath formation, received the intelligence report on the Terran forces in the Vela corridor at 900 station time, and the report said exactly what he had expected it to say. 5 ships, 1 heavy cruiser, 2 destroyers, a frigate, a tender. Against his 83. The forward assault element began advancing at 9:15. The first choke point was reached at 10:43. What happened at the first choke point was not what Solt's formation was designed to encounter. The 5 Terran ships were not at the choke point. They were at the choke point and they were moving, not retreating, not advancing, moving laterally, using the debris field on the choke point's northern edge as partial cover, while their weapon systems fired through gaps in the debris that the Vareth forward element had not identified as firing lanes, because they were not firing lanes in any tactical doctrine that the Vareth had studied. They were firing lanes if you were willing to accept the navigational risk of threading a heavy cruiser through a debris field at combat speed. Lieutenant Vasquez was willing. The first volley from the Franklin hit the lead Vareth assault vessel in its sensor array. Not a kill shot, a specific shot, the kind that required targeting precision that the Vareth tactical assessments had not rated the Terran Confederacy as possessing at this range and under these conditions. The second volley hit the second assault vessel in its forward shield generator, which was a shot that required knowing where the shield generator was on a Vareth assault vessel, which was in the Vareth's technical specifications that were in the Accord's shared database, and which Major Reyes had apparently read and memorized. The destroyers and the frigate hit the compressed formation from two angles simultaneously, which was possible because the choke point had compressed the formation, and compressing the formation had reduced the angular separation between the lead assault vessels, enough that two firing positions could cover 4 targets. In 30 seconds, 4 of the forward assault element's leading vessels were damaged. Then the 5 Terran ships moved. Not into the debris field, out of it, through a gap that put them on the southern edge of the choke point and changed the geometry of the engagement entirely. The Vareth forward element, which had been advancing on a position that was now empty, had to reorient. Reorienting a formation of 37 assault vessels that had been compressed by a choke point took time. Reyes gave them 45 seconds before the second volley. The second volley hit from a completely different angle than the first. Solt watched this from the command element and said to his tactical officer, "What are they doing?" His tactical officer said, "They're not holding position, Arch Commander. They're," a pause, "they're using the debris field's geometry. They're positioning between engagement, not before it." Solt looked at the tactical display. At the 5 Terran ships that were moving constantly, that were never where they had been when the last volley came from, that were using a debris field as a navigation medium in a way that required either extraordinary helm skill or extraordinary disregard for the risk of hull contact with debris at combat speed. Probably both. He looked at the 4 damaged assault vessels. At the time the reorientation was taking. He said, "Compress the formation, push through the choke point faster. If they're mobile, we need volume of fire." His tactical officer began transmitting the order. Akafar, on the Franklin's bridge, watched the Vareth formation compress further and felt the specific quality of a situation that was going the way it was supposed to go, and that contained no guarantee that it would continue doing so. He opened the channel to Reyes, who was at the tactical station on the bridge that had been set up for her with the full sensor feed and the firing solutions and the positioning model she'd been running since they left the base. He said, "They're compressing." She said, "I see it. Their arch-commander is trying to solve the mobile target problem with volume, which is the correct response to a mobile target." She paused. "It's going to work eventually." "How long before it works?" "At current compression rate, their forward element is going to have overlapping coverage of the choke point in," she checked her model. 22 minutes. After that, we can't use the debris gaps the same way. They'll have enough firing angles to cover the gaps." "What do we do in 22 minutes?" "We move to the second choke point," she said, "before the 22 minutes is up. If we move early, they know we're going to the second choke point." "Sir," she said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something that was true even if it was uncomfortable, "they know we're going to the second choke point regardless. We don't have anywhere else to go. The question isn't whether they know, it's whether they're compressed and disorganized when they get there or spread and organized." She paused. We move in 15 minutes. We hit them twice more before we move. We get to the second choke point before they reorganize. Okafor looked at the display, at the compressed formation and the 4 damaged vessels and the 15 minutes. Do it, he said. Rays hit them twice more in 13 minutes. The first hit was from the debris field's northern edge again, same position as the opening, designed to make the Varath element that had been repositioning to cover the northern edge reorient back toward it. The second hit was from the southern edge, while the northern element was reorienting. It was the same trick twice. Military doctrine said you didn't use the same trick twice because the opponent would be ready for it. Military doctrine was right. The Varath northern element was partially ready for the second use of the northern position, and the volley that came from the northern edge hit 2 vessels, instead of the 4 it had hit the first time. But the southern volley, which the northern element's partial reorientation had pulled resources away from covering, hit 3 vessels cleanly, including one that lost drive capability and drifted into the chokepoint debris field's edge with enough impact force to damage 2 adjacent vessels. 3 ships damaged, 2 adjacent ships damaged by the debris collision, for the cost of a reduced northern volley. Reyes said, "Move now." The 5 Terran ships moved. The Franklin came out of the debris field's northern gap at a speed that made Vasquez's helm response the single most important variable in the next 12 seconds, and Vasquez's helm response was 5 seconds, which was what Reyes had asked for, and which Vasquez had delivered because Vasquez had been briefed and understood the plan, and had spent 12 years flying Terran Confederacy ships, in conditions that had taught him that the manual's recommended approach speeds were written by people who had never had a reason to find out what the ship could actually do. The destroyers came out of their positions on the southern edge. The frigate, which had been holding a position that provided fire support for both elements simultaneously, accelerated on the course Reyes had transmitted. The 5 ships moved toward the second chokepoint as a coordinated group, which required all 5 captains to be reading from the same tactical picture, and responding to the same positioning calls, and trusting the same plan, which was possible because Torres had spent 40 minutes on the channel with all 4 other ships before the engagement began, and all 4 captains had said yes when he asked if they understood and had meant it. Solt watched the Terran formation move and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he said, "They're going to the second chokepoint." His tactical officer said, "Yes, sir." Reform the forward element. Standard pursuit formation. We go through the first chokepoint at maximum speed, and we close the distance before they establish position at the second. Sir, our damaged vessels. The undamaged elements pursue. The damaged vessels hold position and provide fire support when we're through the chokepoint. The order went out. The undamaged forward elements began reorganizing for pursuit. It took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, the 5 Terran ships reached the second chokepoint, and Reyes ran the geometry of the second position. And the second position was worse than the first position in 2 ways and better in 1. It was worse because the debris field at the second chokepoint was less dense, which meant fewer gaps to use as firing positions, which meant less flexibility for the lateral movement that had been the central mechanism of the first engagement. It was worse because the Varath pursuit formation was going to arrive with their previous experience of the first engagement, and was going to be specifically watching for the debris gap approach. It was better because the second chokepoint was narrower. Narrower meant more compression. More compression meant a larger portion of the Varath formation was behind the lead elements and couldn't contribute to the engagement without hitting their own ships. A narrower chokepoint was worse for a formation of 83 and less bad for a formation of 5. Reyes explained this to Okafor in 90 seconds. Okafor said, "Less bad." She said, "Yes, sir, less bad." He said, "How long at the second choke point?" She looked at her model, at the pursuit formation speed and the remaining distance, and the time that had passed since the engagement started. She said, "We need 97 more minutes." HFY did the math, reinforcements in 4 hours. Time elapsed approximately 53 minutes. Remaining time needed 97 minutes. 150 minutes total engagement, against 83 contacts. With 5 ships. He said, "Can we do 97 minutes at the second choke point?" She said, "No, sir, not at the second choke point alone." A pause. "We do the second choke point for 45 minutes, then we move to the third. The third choke point puts us at the corridor's far end." "Yes, sir." "If we're at the far end, we have no room to maneuver." "We won't need room to maneuver at the far end," she said. "We need 40 minutes at the far end. At the far end, the corridor opens up on both sides, the debris field ends. The reinforcements come in from the open space side. When they arrive, the Varath are at the narrow end of the corridor with us in front and 6 Sovereign-class vessels arriving behind." She paused. "The position that is worst for us in isolation is best for us when the reinforcements arrive." HFY looked at the display. He thought about his sister saying 4 hours and meaning it. He thought about the TCS Franklin's crew, who had been awake since 400, and who were running a combat engagement against 83 contacts, with the calm professionalism of people who had decided that the quality of their work was going to be the same regardless of the quality of the situation. He thought about Major Reyes, 29 years old, who had built a plan out of choke points and debris gaps, and the geometry of a corridor she had never operated in before today, and who had said less bad with the specific honesty of someone who was not going to make the situation sound better than it was. He said, "Second choke point, 45 minutes, then the third." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Raise." She said, "Sir." He said, "Good plan." She said, "We haven't gotten through it yet, sir." "No," he said, "we haven't." He looked at the display. "Let's get through it." The second choke point engagement lasted 48 minutes. Not 45, 48. 3 minutes longer than Reyes had planned, because the Varath pursuit formation arrived faster than the model projected, which meant the engagement started before the 5 Terran ships were fully positioned, which meant the first 3 minutes were the kind of 3 minutes that nobody wanted, and that the Franklin senior medic, Chief Petty Officer Margaret Chen, spent managing 2 crew members with injuries from the initial volley before the positioning caught up, and the geometry started working in their favor. Webb was hit in the first volley. Not badly, shrapnel from a console that took a vibration impact when the Franklin took a glancing blow on her starboard hull, a cut on his left arm that bled impressively and was not serious. He wrapped it himself without leaving his station, because his station was where he needed to be, and the bleeding was impressive but manageable. Torres took a hit to his operations station that knocked out 3 displays and rerouted his tactical picture to a secondary system that was slower and smaller, and that he adapted to immediately because adapting immediately was what the situation required. The Franklin took 2 direct hits, one to her forward shield emitter, which dropped the forward shield to 60% and required Brody's counterpart on the Franklin, a chief engineer named Specialist David Osai, to do things to the power coupling that were technically inadvisable and practically necessary. The destroyers held. The frigate held. All 5 ships held for 48 minutes and fired 21 volleys and moved 11 times and damaged or destroyed 19 Varath vessels, and did not, at any point, hold a fixed position for long enough for the Varath formation to concentrate fire on them effectively. At the 48-minute mark, Reyes said, "Third choke point, move." They moved. Solt, watching from the command element, looked at the engagement summary for the second choke point. 19 vessels damaged or destroyed. Formation cohesion degraded by the pursuit through the first choke point's debris aftermath. 3 of his best assault ship captains reporting drive damage. Forward element speed reduced by an average of 12% across the surviving vessels. And 5 Terran ships, moving again, moving to the third choke point, moving as a coordinated group with the specific smoothness of ships operating from a shared plan under shared command from someone who clearly understood what she was doing. He said to his intelligence officer, "Who is commanding the Terran formation?" The intelligence officer checked. "The flagship is the Franklin, sir, commanded by Colonel James Ockafer, but the tactical positioning calls are coming from a Major Reyes. She is listed as the tactical lead." "How old is she?" A pause. 29, sir, by the Terran age reckoning. Solt looked at the display, at 19 damaged or destroyed ships, at the corridor geometry and the 3 choke points and the 5 Terran ships moving toward the third. He was 58 years old and had 40 years in the Varath military, and he had studied humanity for 8 months, and he had understood, intellectually, that they were a peer competitor. He was revising that assessment. Not because of the numbers. The numbers were painful but not catastrophic. He still had 60-plus functional assault vessels, and his fire support platforms had barely engaged yet, and his command element was untouched. The numbers said the campaign was damaged, not lost. The revision was about something else. It was about a 29-year-old who had built a choke point plan for 5 ships against 83, and had been executing it for 93 minutes with the specific smooth precision of someone who had not built the plan in the 6 weeks of campaign preparation, but in the 4,000 years of accumulated institutional knowledge that had produced her. He thought about his 8 months of study. He thought about what 8 months was. He opened the channel to the fleet. He said, "Pursue to the third choke point. Full formation. I want the fire support platforms forward. We are going to establish a perimeter around the third choke point and remove their maneuver space." A pause. "These 5 ships have been moving because moving is the only option available to them. We take away the option." His tactical officer said, "Sir, if they're at the third choke point." "I know," Solt said. "The corridor opens at the third choke point. They're going there because the open space gives them maneuvering room when the reinforcements arrive." "Then we need to arrive before them." "We need to arrive at the same time," Solt said, "or close enough that when the reinforcements appear, we have a perimeter already established. And if the reinforcements are stronger than anticipated." Solt looked at the display, at the corridor and the choke points and the 48 minutes of a 29-year-old doing things with 5 ships that his formation of 83 had not been able to stop. He thought about 312 years and 47 wars. He thought about peer competitor. "Then we respond to what the situation is," he said, "not to what the assessment said it would be." His tactical officer looked at him. Solt looked back. "The assessment was incomplete," Solt said. "I am aware of that. We will discuss it afterward." He looked at the display. "Right now we finish the campaign." The fleet moved toward the third choke point. The third choke point was not a choke point in the same sense as the first 2. The debris field that formed the corridor's walls thinned at the far end and opened into a region of relatively clear space, the open end of the Vila corridor, where the transit lanes widened from the narrow passages of the interior to the broad approach vectors of open space. It was, as Reyes had said, the worst position in isolation and the best position when the reinforcements arrived. The 5 Terran ships reached it with 43 minutes to wait. Reyes said, "We don't fight from here, we hold here." Ockafer said, "Explain." She said, "We've spent 97 minutes making them react to us. At the third choke point we have open space behind us and the corridor in front. If we keep moving, we move into their formation. They have enough ships to encircle us in open space. If we hold the choke point entry, they have to come through the narrow entry to engage us, which compresses them again, and the reinforcements arrive at our back in 43 minutes. She paused. We hold. We don't attack. We make them decide whether to push through the choke point entry against our weapons, while the reinforcements are 43 minutes away. HFY said they might push through. She said, yes, sir, but pushing through costs them, and a Varath Archcommander who has been revising his assessment for the last 97 minutes is going to do the math on what pushing through costs and what 43 minutes means. HFY thought about this. He thought about a Varath Archcommander who was 58 years old and had 40 years in the military, and who had, in the last 97 minutes, had his formation compressed through 2 choke points and lost 19 ships to 5, and was now looking at a decision point. He said, you think he'll hold? She said, I think he'll do the right math, sir. HFY said, and if he doesn't? She said, then we fight for 43 minutes and we make those 43 minutes as expensive as we can. A pause. Sir, the whole plan has been making things expensive. That doesn't change. He said, hold position. Weapons ready, we wait. The 5 ships held. The Varath formation reached the 3rd choke point entry at minute 19. 64 ships, 19 damaged or destroyed, several more with reduced capability. Fire support platforms forward, as Solt had ordered. Command elements still at the rear. They stopped at the choke point entry. The standoff lasted 22 minutes. Not because the Varath couldn't push through, because Solt was doing the math. 22 minutes of a 58-year-old military officer, looking at the situation with the specific honesty of someone who had said the assessment was incomplete, and had meant it, and was now applying that honesty to the decision in front of him. The math said, pushing through the choke point entry against 5 ships that had spent 97 minutes demonstrating their willingness to fight from difficult positions would cost additional ships. The math said, the reinforcements were 21 minutes away from the open space at the corridor's far end. The math said, if the reinforcements arrived while the formation was engaged in a choke point push, the formation would be simultaneously fighting forward and responding to a new threat from behind. The math said, this campaign has not gone the way the assessment predicted, and continuing the campaign requires being honest about that. Solt was honest about it. At minute 22, he opened the channel to HFY. He said in the clean Accord translation, Colonel HFY. HFY said, Archcommander Solt. Solt said, your tactical officer is very good. HFY said, I'll tell her you said so. A pause. Solt said, my campaign objective was the Vila corridor, establishing Varath presence and negotiating from territorial control. HFY said, I know. Solt said, that objective is no longer achievable in the current engagement. HFY said nothing. He let the statement sit. Solt said, I am proposing a pause in hostilities pending formal Accord arbitration of the corridor's status. My fleet withdraws to the corridor's entry. Formal arbitration begins within 30 days. HFY said, the Accord arbitration process for the Vila corridor has been ongoing for 3 years without resolution to your satisfaction. What makes you believe another 30 days changes that? Solt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I am going to be more honest about our position in the arbitration than we have been. A pause. The Varath Dominion's claim to the corridor has never been as strong as we represented it to the Accord. We have been waiting for the arbitration to exhaust itself and relying on force as the alternative. The alternative failed. HFY looked at this from every angle he could think of. He opened a side channel to Hayes. He said, Hayes. Hayes said, sir. He said, a Varath Archcommander just told me his force's legal claim to the corridor was overstated, and he wants to go to honest arbitration. Hayes was quiet for a second. Then, sir, in my experience, people who tell you their hand was weak after they lose the hand are usually telling the truth. Nobody admits weakness they don't have to admit. Ikefer thought about this. He went back to the main channel. He said, Arch Commander, I don't have the authority to accept your proposal. That's Accord business and above my grade. Solt said, I understand. Ikefer said, what I can do is relay your proposal to Fleet Command and recommend they transmit it to the Accord, and I can hold my current position pending that relay, which prevents this situation from escalating further while the appropriate authorities decide. A pause. Solt said, that is acceptable. Ikefer said, my reinforcements arrive in 19 minutes. When they arrive, I need them to find this situation exactly as it is now. Your fleet at the choke point entry, my ships at the far end, nobody shooting. Can you hold your formation? Solt said, yes. Ikefer said, then we hold. They held. The 6 Sovereign-class vessels arrived 19 minutes later, exactly when Patricia's timeline had said they would, coming out of transit at the corridor's open end, with the specific readiness of ships that had been moving at maximum speed for 4 hours, and had been briefed on the situation in real time, and had arrived expecting to fight. They arrived to find a standoff. The lead Sovereign-class captain came on the channel, Colonel Ikefer. We're reading the Vareth formation at the choke point entry. What's the situation? Ikefer said, the situation is a proposed pause in hostilities pending Accord arbitration. Hold your formation at the corridor's open end. Nobody shoots until I say so. A pause, understood, sir. Ikefer opened the channel to Fleet Command, to his sister. He said, Patricia. She said, James, I'm watching the sensor feed. What happened? He told her. All of it, the choke points, Ray's plan, the 97 minutes, the standoff, Solt's proposal, the 19 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he admitted the claim was weak. Ikefer said, Hayes thinks he's telling the truth. Patricia said, Hayes is usually right about people. Ikefer said, yes. She was quiet again, the quiet of someone who was also doing math, but different math, political math, strategic math, the math of what the next several months looked like if this went to honest arbitration versus what they looked like if it went to continued conflict. She said, I'll take it to the Accord and to the Joint Chiefs. A pause, James. He said, Patricia. She said, good work. He said, tell Ray's it was her plan. Patricia said, she's getting a commendation. He said, she'd rather have the corridor settled. Patricia said, she'll get both if the arbitration goes right. A pause, hold position, I'll have an answer within the hour. The channel closed. Ikefer sat in the Franklin's command chair and looked at the display. At the Vareth formation, holding. At the 6 Sovereign-class vessels, holding. At the corridor, which was the thing that all of this was about and which was not in this moment anybody's. Ray's was at her tactical station. She was looking at the display too. He said, good work, Major. She said, we haven't settled the corridor yet, sir. He said, no, but we're still here. She looked at the display for a moment. Then she said, yes, sir, we are. Webb, at navigation, was wrapping his cut arm with the second piece of tape he'd used, because the first piece had come loose during the third chokepoint maneuver. Torres was rebuilding his operations display from the secondary system, running diagnostic checks with the systematic patience of someone who intended to have full situational awareness before the next thing happened regardless of how long it took. Park was managing the aftermath of 4 hours of high-intensity communications, with the calm thoroughness of someone who had done this before. Hayes was sitting with his arms crossed. He looked at Ikefer. He said, sir. Ikefer said, Hayes. Hayes said, the Vareth Dominion has not lost a war in 312 years. Ikefer said, that's what the briefings say. Hayes said, they didn't lose today either technically. Standoff pending arbitration. Ikefer said, no, they didn't lose today. Hayes said, but they didn't win. HFY said, no, they didn't win. Hayes said, and they came in here expecting to win. HFY said, yes. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I wonder when the last time was that they didn't win. HFY thought about this. About 312 years and 47 wars. About what it meant to be a civilization that had been winning for long enough that winning had stopped feeling like an achievement. He said, I think today might be when they start finding out. Hayes nodded once. The channel from Accord arbitration opened 90 minutes later. The Vila Corridor arbitration was formally reopened with Varath participation, honest participation, the kind that acknowledged the actual strength of the claim rather than the claimed strength of the claim. It took 4 months. The outcome was a joint administration framework that gave the Varath meaningful access to the corridor's transit lanes and gave the Accord member states who had been using the corridor for 15 years legal protection for that use. Nobody got everything they wanted. Everybody got something they could live with. Solt filed his own report on the campaign. He was 58 years old and he had spent 40 years in the Varath military, and he had studied humanity for 8 months, and he had believed at the end of those 8 months that he understood what he was dealing with. His report said, the campaign failed to achieve its objectives not because of a deficit in military capability, but because of a deficit in understanding. We assessed the Terran Confederacy's military as a peer competitor in terms of hardware and doctrine. We did not assess them as an organization that had been building and refining military thinking for 4,000 years longer than we have been building and refining it. The gap is not in equipment. The gap is in the depth of the institutional knowledge that produced Major Reyes' chokepoint plan in 40 minutes under combat conditions while managing a live engagement. We have studied war for 300 years. They have been studying it for 4,000. These are not equivalent periods of time and should not have been assessed as equivalent. The report was read by the Varath Dominion's War Council. The War Council revised the strategic assessment of the Terran Confederacy. The revision changed the category from peer competitor to something that did not have a comfortable name in Varath military vocabulary. A category that meant roughly, a civilization that is not more powerful than us in the ways we measure power, and is substantially more experienced than us in ways we did not measure because we did not know we needed to measure them. The revision was used as a training document for the next decade. Major Diana Reyes received her commendation. She received it at a ceremony that she sat through with the specific discomfort of someone who did not like ceremonies and attended them anyway because they were part of the job. After the ceremony, HFY found her in the corridor outside the auditorium. He said, Reyes. She said, sir. He said, how does it feel? She thought about it. She said, we held the corridor for 4 hours with 5 ships, sir. The feeling part of that comes after the work part is done. She paused. I'm still on the work part. He said, the arbitration is settled. The work is done. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, then it feels good, sir. A pause. It feels like something that was worth doing. He said, yes, it was. They went back inside for the reception, where there was food that was better than the food in the operational mess and coffee that was better than the coffee on the Franklin, and people who wanted to talk about the engagement in the way that people talked about things after the fact, with the specific comfortable remove of distance from the event. Reyes answered the questions people asked her honestly and briefly and without embellishment, because embellishment was not her style, and the story was already good without it. Outside, in the Vila Corridor, the joint administration framework went into effect. Varath ships and Accord ships used the same transit lanes under the same legal framework, which was not something anyone had predicted as the outcome of a campaign that had opened with 83 warships crossing a border without warning. The Varath Dominion had not lost a war in 312 years. They were very careful, in the years after the Vela Corridor, about the difference between not losing and winning. The difference they had learned was real. And the people who had taught them that lesson were still in the corridor, still using the transit lanes, still doing what they had always done, which was showing up when it mattered with whatever they had and making whatever they had enough. They had been doing that for 4,000 years. They were not going to stop now. The end.